He was a billionaire who thought money could buy anything, until one night, a waitress asked his disabled son to dance. What happened next didn't just shock the entire gala. It shattered his heart and changed his life forever. Money can buy anything. That was what Richard Hamilton believed. He wasn't just rich. He was one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, a man whose name commanded respect in every boardroom and whose wealth could buy luxuries others didn't even dare to dream about. He owned towering skyscrapers that touched the clouds, fleets of luxury cars that sparkled under the city lights, and private islands where only the ocean and silence kept him company. To the world, he was untouchable, living the perfect life of success. But behind the gleam of his empire and the endless applause of society was a shadow he could never escape. That shadow was his only son, Ethan. Ethan was 9 years old, a boy with soft brown hair and eyes that seemed far too gentle for a world that had been cruel to him. Born with a disability that made walking nearly impossible without the heavy metal braces on his legs, every step he took was a battle. While other boys his age raced across playgrounds, climbed trees, and tumbled with laughter, Ethan moved carefully, quietly, always conscious of the weight strapped to his legs. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped smiling. It wasn't always like that. When Ethan was younger, he laughed freely, even when he stumbled. He loved coloring, loved birthday cakes, and loved to hug his father's neck. But as the years passed, things changed. The other children grew faster and stronger, while Ethan struggled just to keep up. Whispered words and careless laughter followed him everywhere. At school, at parties, even in parks. Slowly, his laughter disappeared. He no longer blew out birthday candles with joy. He no longer asked to play outside. Instead, he sat quietly, sketching in notebooks, living more in his imagination than in the world around him. Richard saw it, and it tore him apart. He had tried everything money could buy. Therapists, specialists, expensive treatments flown in from across the globe. He built an indoor therapy gym in their mansion. He bought the most advanced equipment, the most renowned tutors, even toys custom-made to strengthen Ethan's body. Nothing worked. The boy still lived in silence, his spirit shrinking a little more each day. To Richard, business was simple. Numbers always told the truth. When something didn't add up, you solved it. If a competitor rose, you bought them out. If a building fell, you rebuilt a higher. Success had rules, patterns, solutions. But fatherhood was a puzzle with no answer key. Richard loved his son with everything he had, but he didn't know how to show it. The more Ethan pulled away, the more Richard buried himself in work. He told himself it was for Ethan's future, that building an empire would protect his son forever. But deep inside, he feared a truth that clawed at him every night. No amount of wealth could buy back his son's joy. The Hamilton mansion was enormous, but to Ethan, it often felt like a lonely cage. At dinner, the long mahogany table stretched between them like a wall. Ethan picked at his food, silent. Richard scrolled through his phone, pretending not to notice the heavy quiet between them. Sometimes Richard caught himself staring at his son, remembering the day Ethan was born, remembering how he had once held that fragile little body and promised he would give him the world. Now, years later, he wondered if he had already failed. One evening, Richard stood at the door of Ethan's room. The boy was asleep, his chest rising and falling softly. On the nightstand lay a sketchbook. Richard picked it up and turned the pages, and his chest tightened. Page after page, Ethan had drawn children running, playing soccer, climbing trees, and dancing under strings of lights. But in every drawing, Ethan had sketched himself far away, always on the side, always watching, never joining. Richard closed the book quickly, his throat burning. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to tear down every wall that stood between his son and happiness. But he didn't know how. Outside the mansion, Richard wore the mask of the powerful billionaire. At galas, parties, and charity events, he smiled for cameras and shook hands with other men of wealth. People admired him, envied him, copied him. But inside, when the lights dimmed and the crowd disappeared, he was just a father who felt powerless. Friends told him, "Hire more help, Richard. Get Ethan the best teachers, the best schools." But Richard knew none of that was enough. Ethan didn't need another expensive tutor. He needed something Richard couldn't seem to give. Something as simple as belief. The breaking point came on a Friday night. Another charity gala filled with chandeliers, music, and chatter. Waiters moved swiftly with trays of champagne, the orchestra played sweetly, and people in glittering gowns twirled on the dance floor. Richard sat at the head table as always, smiling for appearances. But this time, Ethan sat beside him, stiff in his braces, his small hands clenched in his lap. Richard had thought maybe bringing him out would be good. Maybe the music, the lights, the energy of the crowd would lift his spirits. But instead, Ethan sat silently, staring down at his untouched plate, avoiding the sight of the children dancing freely on the polished floor. Every time Richard looked at him, his chest ached. He wanted to reach out, to say something, to fix it. But what could he say? What could he do? For the first time in his life, the man who could buy anything, who could solve any problem, sat helpless. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Richard noticed her. A young waitress moving gracefully between the tables, balancing trays with ease. She was different from the others, dark skin, bright eyes, a quiet kindness in her face. While the other staff hurried nervously, she slowed down when she reached Richard's table. More importantly, she looked at Ethan, not with pity, not with judgment, but with warmth, with compassion. In that single moment, Richard didn't know it yet, but his life, and his son's life, was about to change forever. It was a grand charity gala, the kind of night where the rich and powerful gathered to be seen. Crystal chandeliers bathed the marble hall in golden light. Waiters carried trays of champagne that glittered like liquid gold, and the air buzzed with music and chatter. The floor sparkled as men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns spun across it, laughing as if life had no weight. At the center of it all, seated at the head table, was Richard Hamilton. The billionaire looked every bit the part, polished suit, sharp eyes, commanding presence. But his mind wasn't here. He scrolled through his phone, sending quick replies to his executives, skimming headlines about markets, pretending the glittering world around him mattered. Beside him sat Ethan, his small figure stiff in a neatly pressed suit, his braces peeking out from beneath the fabric of his trousers. The boy's head was lowered, his eyes fixed on the floor, carefully avoiding the sight of the children laughing and dancing just a few steps away. Richard glanced at his son, now and then, his chest tightening with guilt. He knew Ethan hated being here. The boy had no interest in these loud parties, no strength to join the other children spinning in carefree joy. Still, Richard had brought him, telling himself it would be good for him, though deep down he knew it was only another attempt to fill a silence he didn't know how to fix. And then it happened. Out of the corner of his eye, Richard noticed movement. At the far side of the room, carrying an empty tray, stood a young waitress. She wasn't like the others rushing around with stiff smiles. She moved gracefully, with a quiet confidence that made her stand out against the glittering chaos. She was tall, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow under the chandelier light. Her eyes, gentle, warm, unafraid, rested not on the guests, not on the crowd, but on Ethan. Her name, though Richard didn't know it yet, was Amara. Unlike the wealthy elite who barely noticed Ethan's presence, Amara's gaze lingered. She saw him, not the billionaire's son, not the boy with braces, but a child sitting in silence, trapped in a world that had forgotten to include him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, setting her tray aside, she crossed the room. The crowd hardly noticed her at first. But when she stopped right in front of Ethan and bent down to his level, whispers began to ripple through the hall. Gasps of disbelief, murmurs of curiosity. She was just a waitress. What was she doing? Richard straightened in his chair, confused. His hand twitched as if to stop her, but before he could, Amara spoke. Her voice was soft, gentle, carrying through the silence like music. "Hey," she whispered, "are you enjoying the party?" Ethan looked up slowly. His eyes met hers, uncertain, guarded. No one ever asked him that. Not at parties like this. Not when he sat, invisible, like the furniture. And then, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in months, Ethan's lips curved into a tiny, hesitant smile. Richard froze. He hadn't seen that smile in so long that it almost felt like a dream. His heart clenched painfully, a mix of joy and disbelief. Amara's own smile deepened. She extended her hand, her voice warm and encouraging. "Would you like to dance?" The words hung in the air like a spark, waiting to ignite. The ballroom fell silent. Music still played, but no one seemed to hear it anymore. All eyes turned toward the scene unfolding. A waitress inviting the billionaire's disabled son to dance? It was unthinkable. Guests exchanged puzzled looks. Some whispered behind manicured hands. Others frowned in disapproval. Who was she to step out of her place? Who was she to offer her hand to a boy who could barely stand, much less dance? Richard's chest tightened, unsure of what to do. His instinct screamed to protect Ethan from humiliation, to stop this before it went too far. But something in Ethan's eyes, something fragile and yearning, made him pause. The boy's small hand trembled in his lap. His voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. I can't." A collective sigh moved through the room, as if the guests expected this answer. But Amara didn't flinch. She didn't withdraw her hand. Instead, she leaned a little closer, her eyes glowing with certainty. "Yes, you can," she said softly. "Just one step, and this time you'll lead." Those words pierced through Ethan like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. No one had ever said that to him before. He was always the one being guided, carried, helped. But here was someone telling him he could lead, that he wasn't a burden, that he wasn't broken. His breath shook. Slowly, painfully, he placed his small hand in hers. Gasps echoed through the hall as Amara rose, guiding him gently but not pulling him. Ethan's legs trembled as he stood, the braces clinking faintly. He wobbled, unsteady, but Amara's hand was steady, firm, yet respectful. Support without control. One step, then another. The boy's eyes locked on hers, and together they moved. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but beautifully. Each awkward shuffle, each trembling step, was a victory. The ballroom, filled with the richest people in the city, watched in stunned silence. This was not just a dance. It was courage unfolding before their eyes. And then, in a moment that no one expected, Ethan moved his foot, gently turning Amara. It was small, imperfect, almost clumsy, but it was unmistakable. He was leading. The crowd erupted in applause, the kind that shook the chandeliers and drowned the music. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with astonishment, but no one remained untouched. Richard's throat tightened as tears blurred his vision. For the first time, he wasn't seeing his son as fragile or broken. He wasn't seeing the braces or the struggles. He was seeing strength, courage, a leader. Ethan's face lit up, pure joy flooding back into his eyes as the applause thundered. He was smiling, laughing even, as Amara twirled lightly under his lead. For the first time, Richard wasn't just watching his son exist. He was watching him truly live. And in that instant, the billionaire knew. All the wealth in the world, all the skyscrapers and islands and cars, meant nothing compared to this single dance. Because in that moment, his son wasn't defined by his disability. He was defined by his courage. And it was all because a young waitress had dared to believe in him when no one else did. And what happened next would change Richard's life forever. Ethan hesitated, his small hands trembling as if the weight of the entire room pressed down on his fragile shoulders. The chandeliers sparkled above him, the music swelled around him, and the eyes of hundreds bore into his back. His heart pounded so loudly that he was certain everyone could hear it. I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking, almost too soft to be heard. For a moment, silence settled over the ballroom, heavy and suffocating. Some of the guests turned away, shaking their heads. They had expected this. Of course the boy couldn't. He was weak, disabled, forever dependent. In their minds, the story was already written. But then Amara leaned closer. Her hand didn't tighten around his. She didn't pull or push. She simply held his trembling fingers in hers, her smile warm, unshaken by doubt. "Yes, you can," she said softly, her voice a melody of certainty. "Just one step, And this time you'll lead." The words hung in the air like a spark waiting to catch fire. To everyone else, they were simple. But to Ethan, they were life-changing. No one had ever said those words to him before. No one had ever asked him to lead. He was always the one waiting, being guided, being helped. Always the boy in the background. Always the one others felt sorry for. But in Amara's eyes, there was no pity. Only trust. Something stirred inside him. A small flame, fragile but alive. Slowly, with shaky legs, Ethan pushed himself up from the chair. His braces clinked faintly as he straightened, his knees wobbling under the weight of his own body. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief, his hand instinctively half rising as if to catch his son. But Amara didn't let go. She stayed still, steady, letting Ethan find his own balance. She wasn't guiding him, she was waiting for him, following him. Ethan lifted one foot, the effort written across his face. His lips pressed together, his hands gripped Amara's tightly. But he did it. One step. Then, trembling, another. The floor beneath him seemed to stretch for miles. But with every movement, the flame inside him grew. And then it happened. Ethan moved his foot to the side, his tiny hand shifting just so, and Amara twirled lightly beneath his lead. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't graceful. But it was unmistakable. Ethan had led. For a heartbeat, the entire room froze. The boy who had always been pitted, who had always been sheltered, who had always been told what he couldn't do, had just led a dance in front of hundreds of the most powerful, wealthy people in the city. The silence shattered as the ballroom erupted in applause. The sound thundered against the walls, echoed in the chandeliers, and shook the air with its force. Guests who had moments ago doubted him were now on their feet, clapping, some even cheering. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, moved by what they had just witnessed. But Richard didn't clap. He couldn't. His throat tightened, his chest ached, and tears blurred his vision. He wasn't seeing his son's weakness anymore. For the first time, he was seeing Ethan's strength. Ethan's face lit up. Pure joy spilled across his features, brighter than the golden lights above them. He laughed, a sound Richard hadn't heard in so long it felt like a miracle. With every shaky step, with every imperfect turn, the boy wasn't just dancing. He was breaking free from the invisible chains that had bound him for years. Amara followed his lead with grace, never overtaking, never overshadowing him. She let him shine, and shine he did. The boy who once hid in the corners of his own drawings was now the center of the stage, the star of the night. Richard pressed a hand against his lips, trying to steady his breathing. He remembered all the times he had looked at his son and only seen the braces, the silence, the sadness. But tonight he saw something entirely different. He saw courage. He saw leadership. He saw a boy who had never been broken, only waiting for someone to believe in him. Every step Ethan took was like a declaration to the world. I am more than what you see. I am not weak. I am not a burden. I can lead. The crowd roared again as Ethan managed another small spin, guiding Amara with a determination that made his legs tremble, but his heart soar. And in that moment, Richard knew no skyscraper he had ever built, no empire he had ever commanded, no fortune he had ever earned could compare to this. This was the greatest moment of his life. As the dance slowed, Ethan's legs wavered, exhaustion tugging at him. But before he could stumble, Amara steadied him gently, still letting him stand tall, still letting him believe he was in charge. The applause continued, rolling like waves, refusing to end. Ethan turned to look at his father. Their eyes met. For the first time, Richard saw his son not as fragile, but as powerful. And for the first time, Ethan saw his father not as distant, but as present, really present. Richard's tears spilled freely now. He didn't care about the guests, about appearances, about his billionaire mask. All he cared about was the boy in front of him, the boy who had just shown the world, and his father, what true strength looked like. As Ethan sat back down, breathless but glowing with pride, the room continued to applaud. Amara gave him a smile, one of quiet victory, and Ethan squeezed her hand in thanks. Richard's heart swelled with emotions he couldn't name. Gratitude, awe, love, regret, hope. He knew this was more than a dance. This was a turning point. Tonight, his son had not just taken steps across a ballroom floor. He had taken his first steps into a future where he was not defined by his disability, but by his courage. And Richard understood, in the deepest part of his soul, that his life would never be the same again. After the gala ended and the crowd drifted away into the night, Richard found himself standing in the quiet hallway, his heart still pounding from what he had just witnessed. The applause still echoed in his ears, but louder than that was the sound of his son's laughter, the laughter he thought was gone forever. He spotted Mara near the entrance, gathering her tray, preparing to leave like nothing extraordinary had happened. But Richard knew better. "Wait," he said quickly, his voice hoarse. She turned, surprised to see the billionaire hurrying toward her. His usual calm, commanding presence was gone. Instead, his eyes glistened, and his words trembled. Why did you do that?" Amara tilted her head, her expression soft, calm, almost as if she had expected the question. She wasn't intimidated by the wealth or the power standing in front of her. Instead, she smiled gently, as if speaking to a friend. "Because children don't need people to carry them forever," she said. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe they can lead." The simplicity of her words hit Richard like a storm. He had sat in countless boardrooms, listened to endless speeches, read thick books on success, but nothing had ever pierced him the way those words did. He realized in that moment that he had spent years surrounding Ethan with comfort, luxury, and protection, but never faith. He had given him everything except the one thing that mattered most, the chance to feel capable. Richard didn't know what to say. His throat tightened, and he nodded, blinking back tears. Amara gave him one last smile before quietly walking away into the night, leaving him standing there in silence, holding onto the words that would change him forever. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Richard entered Ethan's room. The boy was sitting on his bed, still glowing from the memory of the dance, his sketchbook resting open on his lap. For the first time in years, there wasn't a lonely figure on the page. Instead, Ethan had drawn himself, dancing, smiling, at the center. Richard's chest tightened at the sight. He sat down beside his son, pulling him close. His voice broke as he whispered, "Ethan, I'm sorry. I thought protecting you meant doing everything for you. I thought love meant shielding you from every fall. But I was wrong. From today, I'll let you lead. Teach me how to be your dad." For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Richard feared he had said the wrong thing. But then, slowly, the boy wrapped his arms around his father's neck and hugged him tightly. It was not the weak embrace Richard remembered from before, but strong, firm, filled with trust. Tears streamed down Richard's face as he held his son. In that embrace, he felt forgiveness, hope, and a bond reborn. The walls he had built with his silence, his distance, his work, they all crumbled in that single hug. For the first time in years, father and son were not divided by fear or doubt. They were together, truly together. That night, Richard didn't return to his office or check his emails. He stayed with Ethan until the boy fell asleep, his small hand still clutching his father's shirt. For the first time, the billionaire didn't feel like a businessman or a leader or an untouchable figure of power. He felt like what he had always longed to be, just a dad. And in that quiet, tender moment, Richard made himself a silent promise. He would no longer measure his life in profits or buildings or accolades. He would measure it in steps, Ethan steps, the small, imperfect, but powerful steps of a boy who had taught his father what true strength really was. Days slowly turned into weeks, and Richard's mansion, once a place of silence and echoes, began to change. The grand halls that had once only heard the sound of footsteps and business calls were now filled with laughter, music, and the occasional sound of clumsy feet stumbling to a rhythm. Instead of starting his mornings with coffee and business reports, Richard began his days with Ethan. The boy, once shy and hesitant, now stood proudly with his braces strapped on, eager to practice small dance steps. Richard would often fumble, stepping on his own feet, causing Ethan to burst into laughter. Every stumble became a celebration. Every step forward was met with high fives and cheers. The walls of the mansion were no longer decorated only with art and wealth. They now carried the sound of joy. Richard realized something astonishing. The moments that once seemed so ordinary, holding his son's hand, spinning him clumsily, falling onto the couch laughing, were more precious than any deal he had ever closed. He had spent years building skyscrapers, but he had never built these memories. Now with every dance, he was building something far greater, a bond with his son. But amidst all this joy, Richard couldn't forget the young woman who had started it all, Amara. Her words haunted him. Sometimes they just need someone to believe they can lead. He knew he had to find her, not only to thank her, but to make her a part of Ethan's journey. After weeks of searching, he finally did. She wasn't in a glamorous place, but in a small community center, teaching local children how to dance with nothing more than a broken radio and her radiant smile. She looked up, surprised, when she saw the billionaire standing at the doorway. "Mr. Hamilton?" she asked, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. Richard shook his head, smiling warmly. "Richard. Just Richard." He took a deep breath. "I've been looking for you. That night at the gala, you changed my son's life. And mine." Amara lowered her gaze humbly. "I didn't do anything special. I just gave him a chance." Richard stepped closer, his voice gentle. "No, you gave him dignity. You gave him belief. And that's something even I, with all my wealth, had failed to give. Amara, Ethan needs you. We both do. Not as a waitress, not as an employee, but as his mentor, his teacher." Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she nodded. "If Ethan wants me there, then yes. I'd be honored." And so a new chapter began. Amara became part of their lives, not as a servant, but as family. She taught Ethan not just dance steps, but confidence. She encouraged him to laugh when he stumbled, to hold his head high even when his braces felt heavy, and to always believe in the strength of his heart. Richard watched in awe. His son, who once shied away from crowds, was now smiling, moving, and shining brighter than ever. Every day, Ethan grew, not just in ability, but in spirit. And Richard, humbled, realized that Amara was teaching him too. She was teaching him how to listen, how to let go of control, and how to follow his son's lead. Months later, another grand event was announced, a charity gala, just like the one where everything had changed. But this time, things were different. The chandeliers sparkled, the music swelled, the wealthy guests filled the hall. Yet, all eyes were on the stage where Ethan stood, his braces shining under the lights, his face glowing with confidence. When the music began, Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, moving with rhythm and grace, his little body swaying with joy. But he wasn't alone. Richard stood right beside him, not leading, not guiding, but following. For the first time in his life, the billionaire allowed his son to take the spotlight, while he simply kept pace. The crowd, at first stunned, quickly erupted into thunderous applause. Some wiped tears from their eyes, unable to believe that the shy boy they once pitied was now dancing with pride. Others looked at Richard with admiration, not for his wealth or power, but for the father he had become. But Richard wasn't looking at them. His eyes never left Ethan. He wasn't seeing a boy with braces, or a child who needed help. He was seeing his hero, the boy who had taught him what true strength was, the boy who had changed his life forever. As the music ended, Ethan spun around clumsily and laughed, and Richard laughed with him, tears streaming down his face. He knelt down, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered, "You're my greatest teacher." In that moment, Richard understood something that all the money in the world could never teach. True wealth isn't in the skyscrapers you own, the cars you drive, or the islands you buy. True wealth lives in the love you give, the courage you inspire, and the moments you share with the people who matter most. That night, as the hall roared with applause, Richard Hamilton, the billionaire who once thought money could buy anything, finally discovered the priceless treasure he had been searching for his whole life. And it was right there, smiling, dancing, and leading him all along. That night, Richard realized, true wealth isn't found in money, cars, or mansions. It's found in the courage of a child's first step, the love you give, and the moments you'll never forget. Because in the end, it wasn't the billionaire who changed his son's life. It was his son who changed his.